It's good to see people back. Good for, morning of learning, afternoon of learning, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. And just to remind people, this is the third session of this class, ongoing class with Rabbi Levi Morrow, titled "The Man of Faith in the Age of AI: What Rav Joseph Soloveitchik could teach us about society, each other, and ourselves." This third class will continue to explore the questions of personhood, bringing what we saw in class 2 to bear on how we think about God. Is God a person? Is God necessarily super intelligent? Is there some feature of God that AI could develop that would then make AI God? This will enable us to rethink what makes something a mitzvah and what it means to have a, quote, halakhic community where God is somehow present. We will read The Lonely Man of Faith together with Rav Soloveitchik's essay Catharsis to imagine a community which respects the individuality of all these members. As class starts, I will post source sheets in chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. We want to hear you. Best part, that questions come with learning. So if you want to ask questions in chat on either platform, Zoom or Facebook Live, I'll bring them to Rabbi Morrow's attention. Don't hesitate. If you're an attendee, I can make you a panelist or unmute you so you can speak. But we want to hear your thoughts. Do not hesitate. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Morrow for today.
Thank you, Kayla, for the introduction and for holding the logistics side of this. Thank you again to Drisha for the opportunity to teach these classes. Thank you everyone for joining us. To echo what Kayla just said, yes, please, questions. I'd much rather answer lots of questions than read lots of texts. So that I think the best class is usually a balance of the two. And I have lots of text prepared, but I would love to have questions as well. Okay, so to briefly summarize the first two classes in our 4-part series, now that we're rounding the corner into the second half, the first class we talked about technology more broadly. We said AI is part of the broader human project of technology and, using our minds to understand the world and make things that make our lives better. We saw how for Rav Soloveitchik, that's like the characteristic feature of modernity and the ways he thought that was a good thing and a bad thing, and how that can affect how we think about AI as something that people do rather than as a thing that exists in and of itself. In the second class, we looked at AI more directly in terms of what are the things that exist today people call artificial intelligence, how do they work, how does that relate to the question of personhood and what it means to be a person, and based on Rav Soloveitchik's grappling with the question of what does it mean to be a person and how do people work together in communities, we looked at AI and sort of try to think about it through that lens. So we're going to continue with this question of personhood today to first explore God, then mitzvot and the halakhic community and the way they'll all sort of go together. With that one, we'll look quickly at a PowerPoint that will help explain, I think, why I'm taking this jump to God, because it was not something that was necessarily going to be as obvious to me. This was like the right path to go down with the AI question, but it became very necessary for a reason you will all understand in a second. Okay, so a class called Deus Ex Machina, little God out of the machine, a good literary term that works very well for this discussion. But more importantly, I got sent this article from the Daily Beast about a movement that was going to worship AI as a new God. And then this one, it's a totally different church movement planning to, in some sense, worship AI. And then one last one, which is not quite the same thing, but close. This is an Israeli model, Leora Cole, who, when she's not doing modeling stuff, is making what she calls the Robo-Rabbi, an artificial intelligence project that taps into the teachings of Torah. And you tell the AI your bar mitzvah parsha, bat mitzvah parsha, and they they'll like come up with religious guidance for you. And the last one is sort of in some ways the most explicitly Jewish. The only one that's explicitly Jewish, but it gets down at the idea of religious guidance is how we think about sort of rabbinic authorities or religious leaders. But with sort of that model, the God question is a question of mitzvah, right? What makes an AI God? For these people, broadly, is the idea of the super intelligence, right? So that's why that was in the class discussion, class description, is that, oh, AI is going to be super intelligent. It's going to be able to just understand everything and know everything and run the world. And those sort of slide one into the next. And the idea behind this, robo-rabbi is roughly that if the AI is capable of understanding everything, then it can give valuable religious guidance, knowing just like a little bit about you. And there's an assumption in there that the basis for valuable religious guidance, or for, in the context of God, like godliness, is super intelligence, is now understanding everything. And we're going to come back around sort of to this sort of idea in a little bit. We'll talk about the traditional discourse of ta'ameh hamitzvot, of giving reasons for the commandments. But I want to like dig down on that, like challenge, is that really the case, right? It's like, do we think that God is by definition super intelligent? I think it's a pretty common intuition, right? So, omniscience, the fancy word for know, all knowing. God sort of knows everything. There's sort of technical medieval debates about what exactly God can know and not know, including like, does the future exist such that God could know it or not know it? But like, I think more important is that a feature of God? So we think that if something else knew everything, would that make them God, right? If AI was super intelligent, would that make it God on like a factual level, or even more practically on like a functional level? Should we treat AI as some sort of supreme being, some deity, if it could really sort of know everything? Would that make it a valuable source of religious guidance, or even of mitzvah, of some sort of religious command? And so that is going to be the basic idea of this class, is what does it mean to be God? What does it mean to be a person? Is God a person? And how is that related to questions of mitzvot? And recall we spoke last time about personhood in context of Rav Soloveitchik, in context of the only man of faith, as to have fundamental commitments that in some ways exceed even your own understanding of yourself, right? You're not fully self-transparent. You have these basic commitments, and you are, want to embrace them and live with them and work based on them. And so it's like, how much does that model apply to God? And one thing I'm going to say is that we're already here going to start doing something I mentioned last time, which is not necessarily, I think last time we used the phrase reading Rav Soloveitchik against himself. I think I would go a little more gently and say, looking at things Rav Soloveitchik says that he might not be super consciously saying, as it were. It's not something that's the point he's trying to say, but it is there. And so that's going to take us to the question of like, what is God's person? What does it mean for God to be a person? And we're going to do that by way of talking about dialogue and revelation. And that will sort of naturally bridge into the question of mitzvot and halakha and the halakhic community from revelation. Dialogue, as like a philosophical term, or the second of background, like simply means, two people talking to each other. But it's something that becomes really important in philosophy in general, and in modern Jewish philosophy in the early 20th century, even the end of the 19th century. We talked a little bit in the first class about the rise of alienation in modern society, about everyone moving to cities at the same time that really modern industry and automation are starting to get moving, and the way there's sort of broad worry about technology causing alienation. And so one of the sort of philosophical movements you find pushing back against that is what's called dialogic philosophy, or the philosophy of dialogue, of what does it mean to really encounter another person one-on-one, face-to-face, true sort of meaningful encounter that overcomes alienation. Like in the Jewish context, you have Franz Rosenzweig or Rabbi Arav Yeshua Heschel who are doing this sort of thing, but also probably more famously Martin Buber is involved in this, and also Emmanuel Levinas in France. And Buber and Levinas are kind of the two who made the jump from Jewish philosophy to philosophy more broadly, and they become important philosophical figures. I think, Lindsay, last time you mentioned Martin Buber in the I and thou language that Rav Soloveitchik is using, which he attributes to the existentialists, but Buber was known as existentialist, so either he's getting it directly from Buber or from people influenced by him. But Buber became a very influential figure for this idea, for that there is the I and the thou, fancy German word, or fancy English word for you. And he's, ye, the I speaks to the thou, this direct second person I, you conversation. And we're going to look at now is going to be sort of how does Rav Soloveitchik navigate that in terms of lowly man of faith. And it's going to be directly connected to this question of personhood. How can you have one person talking to another person in ways that avoid, which I saw last time and time before, in terms of like him seeing society as being very much run on technological rationality that doesn't have room for the individual. How do we do that? How does that work? And then does that apply to God? So with that, I'm going to jump into our source sheet, which should also be in the chat. Okay, so yes, the personhood of God, community here, self, and other, dialogue, and revelation, right? So self and other are sort of two other terms you get for I and thou, right? How you have yourself and the other person. And we talk about dialogue here. So he describes the process of dialogue. This is going to be in almost we'll read this in this way. His distress and bliss, joys and frustrations are incommunicable within the framework of the natural dialogue consisting of common words. Is that normal conversation can't really capture emotions well. And by emotional, he doesn't just mean, it's sometimes also like the things that flow from your deep commitments. Right? He says when you have an emotion, it's because you have a certain value that shapes how you evaluate whatever things you're engaging with in your world, what you're experiencing in your life. And those aren't things you can easily put into language. By the time homo absconditus, the hiding person, the person who's, for him, all surface, who's living in terms of instrumental rationality, in terms of efficiency, and what I called last time resume values, the thing they manage to deliver the message, the personal and intimate content of the latter, is already recast in the lingual matrix, which standardizes the unique and universalizes the individual. So for Rav Soloveitchik, the first thing is to differentiate dialogue in this sort of like philosophical sense from ordinary conversation. He says 9 times out of 10, when you talk to someone, not just like talk to someone on the street, talk to someone you know pretty well, the conversation doesn't get down to the level of like, well, what do you actually care about? And like, what are the things that we disagree on like an important value level? And like, how can I hear that from you? That sort of thing. Most of the time, even if you have those differences, you get glossed over entirely in the conversation. And that's one of his main sort of worries in this book, is that something that happens constantly. I didn't put a good text. This doesn't have a great text for saying this is how this works in the abstract in the positive sense, but it'll become clear as we move into I think it'll become clear as we move into like the second section. But essentially, part of his question throughout the book that he wants to be thinking about and working for is how do we make room for this sort of conversation? What does it mean to try and put the inexpressible into language? And does that work at all? And if so, how? Or if it doesn't work, is it possible to have some sort of dialogue that's essentially silence, right? Where you make space for the other person and recognize the other person without this problem happening of, the things that you try to express get rendered superficial and almost meaningless by the way you're just using language that everyone uses for everything, by cliche. But another example of this sort of dialogue where he's trying to grapple with this sort of problem is tefillah, is prayer. Right? Prayer for Rav Soloveitchik in general, and then in Lowly Man of Faith specifically, is about this question of how do we bring the deepest part of ourself to God, to talk to God. And part of the problem that he has to deal with is Rav Soloveitchik is deeply committed to the traditional text of the Siddur, right? And so if there's a tension between the social and the individual, between the wordy and the wordless, like what do you do with the Siddur? I'm going to read this paragraph. We'll talk about it a little more. The total faith commitment, right? That's the word he likes from last time, commitment, tends always to transcend the frontiers of fleeting amorphous subjectivity and to venture into the outside world of the well-formed objective gesture. These things inside you, we want to express them, But that's when you run into the problem of the way it's recast in the lingual matrix. So we want to take deeply personal and make it shareable and talk to other people about it. We want to be seen in that sense. We talked last time about this is what he calls redemption, is when you can be seen with all your individuality and your personal nature in a way that doesn't obscure it. However, no matter how important this tendency on the part of the faith commitment is, and it is of enormous significance in halakha, which constantly demands from man that he translate his inner life into external facticity, it remains unalterably true that the very essence of prayer is the covenantal experience of being together with and talking to God, right? Togetherness and talking to, dialogue. And that the concrete performance of such as the recitation of texts represents the technique of implementation of prayer and not prayer itself. Right? He wants to separate between the technique of implementation, like the actual acts of prayer that we're doing, the speaking, the reciting of texts, and for the prayer itself, the essence of prayer, what you're really doing via those words, which is sort of bringing yourself to the text, bring yourself to God in this sort of moment of togetherness. And he has a whole book called Worship of the Heart. The first like 3 or 4 essays are really all on this topic. And he makes it very clear. He talks about it because the depth crisis, bringing the everyday crisis of being a finite human being and recognizing your own weaknesses, the things you're struggling with, the ways you feel alienated from other people, and bringing that sort of to an encounter with God. And so people who want to know more about it, I recommend taking a look there, the Worship of the Heart. But for our purposes, he wants to make this distinction. Right? The way true dialogue works is when this happens, when you have words and you manage to speak through the words things that transcend them, right? Things when you try and use words, that are inevitably representative of society and part of words you learned growing up from other people. Like words are things that we don't ever make up. It's very rare someone makes up a word and it becomes part of usable language in society. More often than not, our languages are things into which we are born or which we pick up along the way in life, which means that they're not necessarily going to be automatically well suited for expressing, our deepest thoughts and concerns. And so that when you manage to do that, when you manage to use these words you've picked up from outside yourself to express things from inside yourself, that would be what he calls sort of true dialogue. So, I see there's a question in the chat. No, wonderful. Let's keep moving into the prophecy bit, and then that we'll take some questions after we talk about prophecy. With Rav Soloveitchik, a prophecy is going to be how we bridge this from talking about us to talking about God, and that's going to go by way of the relationship between prayer and prophecy. So this is from chapter 7 of The Only Man of Faith. It's a whole extensive discussion of prayer and prophecy. And again, recommended, and we want to look at it inside. We're looking at just like a small piece of it. It's prayer and prophecy are two synonymous designations of the covenantal God-man colloquy. And colloquy is just a fancy word for conversation. Indeed, the prayer community was born the very instant the prophetic community expired, and when it did come into the spiritual world of the Jew of old, it did not supersede the prophetic community, rather perpetuated it. And he says, the idea of tefillah, and tefillah as sort of an organizing principle of community, was born when prophecy ended. And he has a whole discussion in the text here of the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who are counted as sort of the last of the prophets and the beginning of the rabbis. And one of the things that the Gemara says they did is sort of establish prayer in some sense, like a little question of exactly what that looks like. At the very least, they're the ones who come up with the beginning of our fixed set of prayer, and eventually the people who say you should daven 3 times a day, and corresponding to the sacrifices. But he's saying that the way this works is that they sensed that prophecy was ending, right? Some of them were among the last of the prophets, and they said the prophecy represents this conversation, this ongoing dialogue between God and humanity, and we want to perpetuate that. And so in order to perpetuate it, we're going to create a new dialogue, this time prayer. The prayer is the continuation of prophecy, and the fellowship of prayerful men is ipso facto the fellowship of prophets. The difference between prayer and prophecy is, as I've already mentioned, related not to the substance of the dialogue, rather to the order in which it is conducted. Well, within the prophetic community, God takes the initiative, he speaks and man listens. In the prayerful community, the initiative belongs to man. He does the speaking and God the listening. The word of prophecy is God's and accepted by man. The word of prayer is man's and God accepts it. Right? So he has here two sides to a dialogue, right? Like any good dialogue, there are two partners involved. Sometimes one person is speaking, sometimes the other one is speaking. He's what he called, the God-man colloquy. If you want to pick out any one side of it, you call it prophecy or you call it prayer, right? Two beings coming to sort of meet in the middle, and depending on who speaks, we call it a different thing. This is important because this means that there are two people involved in the sense we've been talking about what it means to be a person, right? And what it means to be someone who brings your depth, your commitments, the things about yourself that aren't, acceptable in a utilitarian society, to bring those into this dialogue. And that makes sort of more obvious sense when we're talking about prayer. Prayer is when you can bring that moment to God. And in some sense, like the meaning of the fact that we ask for things in prayer. The traditional liturgy of the Shemona Esrei Amidah is, 19 brachot, most of which are requests for things, is about the fact that what you're really expressing in that moment is the underlying sense of, I'm not able to get things for myself all the time. I'm not, this being of unlimited capacity who can run my life the way I want it to run. There are moments of weakness that are a natural part of human being that you bring to this. But what does that mean for God, right? If that's what dialogue is, what does it mean to say God brings that to people in some sense? And Rav Soloveitchik doesn't give us a good answer for that, right? Rav Soloveitchik doesn't say, and God has God's own depth crisis that God brings into prayer, into the prophecy moment, right? But what he does have is the content of revelation, right? He says that God does reveal something in prophecy. Prophecy for Rav Soloveitchik as an Orthodox rabbi and as a very specific sort of thinker who's very committed to law, knows obviously what revelation is, right? Prophecy in Tanakh is a much broader phenomenon. In Nevuah, you could, pick out different examples from Jewish history to say, what is it, what is it not? For Soloveitchik, it's very simple. In source number 5, any encounter with God that is to redeem man must be crystallized and objectified in a normative, ethico-moral message, right? Is to have some sort of normative, ethical, moral message, something that's obligatory, having to do with ethics and morality, right? With actions that we're supposed to do. The above said, which is true of the universal faith of community in general, has particular validity for the halakhic community. And here I'll just note a distinction between two different types of communities he talks about in the book. That most of the book is very universally oriented, right? Very human oriented. In this class, we're going to actually converge a little bit on the specifically Jewish, right? So he has a halakhic community as one example of what he calls more broadly like covenantal communities or faith communities in general. The prime purpose of revelation, in the opinion of halakha, is related to the giving of the law, right? Revelation, dialogue that, where you're bringing your depth into it, is also the moment where you give the law, where God gives the law. The God-man confrontation serves a didactic goal. God involves himself in the covenantal community through the medium of teaching and instruction, right? Didactics means teaching and instruction. Halakha has looked upon God since time immemorial as the teacher par excellence. This educational task was in turn entrusted to the prophet, whose greatest ambition is to teach the covenantal community. In short, God's word is ipso facto, so by definition, God's law and norm. Right? That revelation, the same way human dialogue between two people, always takes place through the medium of words, or the attempt to reveal that which is beyond words through the words that we find available for us, that we share with the other person. And the same way that tefillah involves trying to express yourself through a text that is in parts hundreds or thousands of years old that you didn't choose, but you find before you. Tefillah for Rav Soloveitchik, or no, revelation of Soloveitchik, is God attempting to bring God's self into the covenantal community by way of these words and norms. And these words and norms are going to become the fabric of the halakhic community. It's going to be a community that defines itself based on these words and norms. But what they are fundamentally is it about the place wherein we find God's depth commitments, right? God's things that exceed rationality, that aren't necessarily like something that wholly makes sense, where we sort of open up to God's being present to us without attempting to fit that into our own box. The revelation is, in a sense, God's self-expression, in the sense of bringing those forward. And the same way that we said there can be this sort of almost silent listening aspect to human dialogue for Soloveitchik, that's true also revelation, right? The attempt to hear God through the lens of the halakha, and hear God, and simply hearing the part God as something that's not, it doesn't fit into rationalistic, instrumental, utilitarian thinking. It doesn't fit into the normal, how do I do this well impulse by which we tend to guide our lives. Okay, so I've spoken a bunch right now. If there are any questions, I'm super happy to take them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of stuff in chat, and also, please, I want to be able to unmute you so you can ask questions. But I just want to highlight, I think this was something Lindsay said. This was maybe a sort two back. So in this case, humanity is the expert on humanity, and God is the expert on the divine, and there's engaged dialogue between the two that contradicts meaning. Did I get that right? And halakhic dialogue / instruction becomes a means of enforcing communal and religious norms, or incorporating the divine into everyday life. I am also seeing shades of halakhic man here as well.
All right, so in terms of humanity, expert on humanity, and God expert on divine, there's something there in terms of also like part of this idea of dialogue that goes deeper than everyday words means you have to trust the other person as sort of the expert on themselves. But simultaneously, it's not about expertise in the sense that the person is an expert on humanity and like knowledge as the standard of qualification. Like standards and qualifications and knowledge are a whole semantic field we want to sort of set aside for this for Soloveitchik, because it's about accessing sort of what's deeper than knowledge. But only God can tell you about God, and only another person can tell you about themselves. So that's definitely true. In terms of enforcing communal and religious norms, we're going to come back to that for the end of the class. We're going to round to the halakha community. You asked for this last class, but in order to get there, we have to explain what halakha is for Soloveitchik, which requires going through this. And shades of halakhic man as well. There's definitely some of that, including because for halakhic man or Soloveitchik more broadly, like halakha is just all pervasive. Like it's a little less than than the impression you'd get just from halakhic man. But yeah, it's a defining feature of religion. He's like, look, revelation for other religions might be whatever it is, but for him, Jewish revelation is just law. Like that is the fundamental feature of law, which puts him into an odd tension here, right? Law, as we're going to talk about, is in the third person. Law is a thing shared by everyone who's subject to it. Law doesn't care about you specifically. Law cares about you as a category of subject of the law. And so the question is, how do you navigate that when you do care about people specifically? And how does that work to use law in the third person as a vehicle for, making space for the second person, for the first person, for the depth of someone in the ways they don't fit into the everyday categories? All right. Anyone else on Facebook or anything? Or no? Great. We'll go back
Right on
into
Facebook. If you're in the
Great.
attendee box and you have thoughts, please, we want to hear them. But
I'm good to keep teaching. I love this stuff, but I also love questions. Okay, so given that, that's going to shape the way we talk about the mitzvot. And I've got written here reasons for the commandments, sort of standard English translation for the Hebrew phrase ta'ameh hamitzvot. Ta'am meaning something like a reason, sense. It is the traditional discourse going back to really the medieval era with roots as in the Midrashim and the Chazal, but really getting off the ground in the medieval era of saying, well, here's what the mitzvot are for, right? Like, well, here's what they can accomplish. What kinds of things can they accomplish or can't they accomplish? Like, right, some of this discussion is what would God care about such that God would give commandments that would lead you in that direction, would try and achieve this? Like, what is a satisfactorily valuable aim that we could call it a divine aim in some sense? And those sort of things, like some people are like, well, we can't ever say there's things that would like be divine aims. We can't know that. So the mitzvah would have no reason, something like that. And probably the most famous person attacking that and saying, no, every mitzvah has a reason. Everything has some like very clear function that it plays in the world is Rambam, Maimonides, most of the third section of his philosophical magnum opus, The Guide for the Perplexed, is on this topic. And this is something that Rav Soloveitchik like talks about a bunch. So I have here a footnote on one of these texts to one of Rav Soloveitchik's early works, the halakhic mind, and the whole like last section is saying Rambam's whole project of giving reasons for the commandments is sort of ridiculous. It's not edifying on a religious level, and he wants to oppose the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah. Rambam's like halakhic work is there. He does good stuff in terms of what are the reasons for the commandments. In contrast to the philosophical one, where he's always trying to give technical reasons for the mitzvot. And so we're not going to look at that text, but again, anyone who wants to delve more deeply into this topic is recommended to go check out Halakhic Mind at the end of it. We're going to look at the way he talks about this in Lonely Man of Faith. He's going to do so based on this distinction you see here in the first sentence of source number 6 between the covenantal faith community and the religious community. And first, I just want to appreciate that on a rhetorical level, and a conceptual level, that he's choosing to oppose the faith community, right, the covenantal community of faith, with the religious community. And this is from the 9th chapter of Halakhic Man, Lonely Man of Faith. In some ways, it's for me is where a lot of the book really gets off the ground. You see a lot of the application of what he's built up until then. And one of the things that you find is that it turns out one of the like bad guys of the book, if you want to talk about the book in terms of like what's a problematic kind of being, kind of community, kind of way of living your life that he's trying to attack and explain why it's bad, it's the religious community. Like the religious community is something he's opposed to. And in some ways there's we'll talk about in a second, a sort of chilul, a desecration, a profanation of the holy that's involved in the religious community. He says, while the covenantal faith community is governed, as I emphasized, by a desire for redeemed existence, right? The good community is aiming for redemption. The religious community is dedicated to the attainment of dignity and success, and is, along with the whole gamut of communities, such as the political, scientific, and artistic, a creation of Adam the First, all conforming to the same sociological structural patterns, right? And we talked about how the book is structured based on Adam the First, who's associated with politics and science and art and success and dignity and all of those things, versus Adam II, who's associated with covenant and faith and redemption and sacrifice and dialogue, right? And the faith community, which he wants to be about, that, commitment to deeper values, is subverted by Adam I when it becomes the religious community. Right? So the religious community is therefore also a work community consisting of two grammatical personae, not including the third person. We'll come back to that bit, but it's a work community, right? The people who think that religion can actually further their lives in a valuable sense, in the sense of how do we make our lives better? How do we attain the most efficient way of living, the most successful and effective way of living? Religion is an important part of that. Religion can add value to that. And sort of every time you hear people say, well, what's the evolutionary value of mitzvot or something like that? Well, that's what he's opposed to, saying like, what's the value? What is it? How does it contribute to your life? Right. And this is the sort of thing you come across a lot in like popular American culture when people talk about like meditation, right? What does meditation give to your life? And I'm not an expert. I'm not here to criticize it in a like a valuable sense, but on a technical level, the things that might once have been like religious, and saying, well, how can this be utilitarian? Right. And if it works for you, great. I'm not opposed to it, but that is the sort of thing he's talking about. And we'll see that in a second. Further, the prime purpose of the religious community is the successful furtherance of interests, not the deepening and enhancing of commitments. A man who values religion in terms of its usefulness to him and considers the religious act a medium through which he may increase his happiness. Right. And so not only is this just giving more space to Adam I, and one of his concerns in the book is to have built a community, built a world where there's no space for for out in the second, where there's no space for values for things that aren't utilitarian. But there's also an act like a element of desecration here. You've taken something that was supposed to be holy, supposed to be about what's greater than us and beyond ourselves, and you've reduced it to being about, again, how do I make myself happier? Again, how do I improve my life instead of commune with something beyond me or take part in something beyond me. One of the metaphors he's for talking about this in the question is the untranslatability, or translatability as a translation, as a model for thinking about this. And the question of how can you, I think we were talking before about language, is can you put that which is wordless into language, right? He talks about that for mitzvot as well. He says there is like some degree to which this is possible, to which you can translate, in putting in context of Revelation we talked about before, you translate God's depth commitments into language. It's not a total impossibility for God to appear in mitzvot, and it's not a total impossibility for us to speak to each other through language. It's not a total impossibility to say, like, oh, here's ways in which religion does contribute to your life. But it becomes a problem when it's thought that, like, you can reduce mitzvot into the ways they contribute to your life. So the untranslatability of complete faith experience is not due to the weakness, but to the greatness of the latter, right? He says not that mitzvot are sort of so bad or weak. He says that they don't contribute to your life, that you can't render them in utilitarian language. It's just they're so beyond that. If an all-embracing translation of the great mystery of revelation and its charisma were possible, and charisma is a word he gets from contemporary Christian theology, it just means message, the message of revelation, then the uniqueness of the faith experience and its commitments would be lost, right? If you could totally reduce the religious way of life, the Jewish way of life, to its utilitarian elements, to how it can be valuable, then you would actually lose out on the aspect of commitment beyond value, or beyond, utility. Only peripheral elements of the act of faith can be projected on a cognitive, pragmatic background, right? To the degree that you can give Tamei HaMitzvot, you can point to factually, like empirically, how being religious in whatever ways might improve your life. He said that's always going to be a peripheral part of faith. Prayer, for instance, might appeal to majestic man, again, Adam the First, as the most uplifting, integrating, and purifying act, arousing the finest and noblest emotions. Yet these characteristics, however essential to Adam the First, are of marginal interest to Adam the Second, who experiences prayer as the awesome confrontation of God and man, and as the great paradox of man conversing with God as an equal fellow member of the covenantal society, and at the same time being aware that he fully belongs to God and that God demands complete surrender and sacrifice, right? So the religious community as a form of gathering ourselves, organizing ourselves, is, an unfortunate side effect of the halakhic community, let's say. The Rav Soloveitchik wants us to come together as a halakhic community. And the problem is that the same way we have, he would say, a natural tendency to always shift from thinking in terms of values, in terms of what are the things in my life I think are so important that it's worth sacrificing for on some level. We have a tendency to shift and think, well, how does this contribute to my life? What's the kind of life I'm building? Same is true on a communal level, that we have a tendency to shift from, we are building a community where we come together as people who all believe in the same values and sacrifice for the same things, to become a community defined by how can these things all improve our lives as individuals. And also, we're going to see in the second, how did this become a society with its own norms, where the religious community is still a community of success, even if it's based on other standards, on halakhic standards. Any questions at this point? Okay, great.
All quiet in chat, so far at
Okay.
least.
Yeah. So then we're going to move from this discussion, from Tamei HaMitzvot, which fits like a thinking about Tamei HaMitzvot as God's irrational commitments, as it were, as our openness to God's mitzvot beyond rationality, the same way that dialogue means being open to other people beyond their, the ways in which they make sense to us, and accepting the parts of them that both to us and as part of broader society are not normal like not considered valuable. We're going to move from there to talking about the halakhic community and how does, what does that look like? This is another place where we're going to read Rav Soloveitchik for sort of more than what he's saying, because Lindsay, this gets to your point that like communities are in some ways defined by having standards. And the moment you have the halachic community, you're going to have halachic standards. And so what do we do with that? How does this work? Does it work? Is it that he says that people of faith are just sort of always defined by the ways in which they don't work with broader society, but with like Western society more broadly, with sort of the secular world, with however you want to define that. And then we, as a community, we all get together, we all sort of commiserate over the fact that we don't fit outside the community. Or do similar dynamics suddenly begin to obtain within the community as well? That within the community, you have the same tension between individual and society that he depicted within the broader community. So we're going to look at a couple of texts that will set up for this from Lonely Man of Faith. We're going to talk a little about God in the community and stuff like that. Well, one text from an essay called The Community, which just lays out the issue sort of pretty specifically. And then we're going to look at a text from an essay called Catharsis. And this is another one of my just favorite Rav Soloveitchik texts. And I'll explain that up a little more when we get to it. So I'm going to share the source sheet again. Great. Okay, so the change from a technical utilitarian relationship to a covenantal existential one occurs in the following manner. When God joins the community of man, the miracle revelation takes place in two dimensions. In the transcendental, Deus absconditus emerges suddenly as Deus revelatus, right? The hidden God becomes the revealed God. And in the human, Homo absconditus sheds his mask and turns into Homo revelatus, becomes, the revealed human. Let us not forget that the covenantal community includes the he who addresses himself to man. Right, so this is going to be sort of, in some sense, the final picture of his discussion of dialogue that we've been talking about so far. That for him, human dialogue between two people doesn't just share the same basic model as the human divine dialogue. He makes a sort of causal claim that it's dependent upon the human divine dialogue. And we'll talk about that in a second in this next source. But the other thing I want to say is here is we'll not forget the covenantal community includes the he who addresses himself to man, right? And so this is part of Rav Soloveitchik's pushing back against Buber. There's not just I and thou, it's also he. That by virtue of being a community, it involves the third person. It involves saying there's more going on here than just dialogues between two people. There's a he and a we. You would say that we are surrounded by other people. And the question becomes, once we're building a community that's not just about dialogue between two people, what happens to all the problematic dynamics of social life? Well, that social life tends toward having accepted standards that not everyone's going to live up to. It tends towards leaving, some people feel as if they are unacceptable, those sorts of questions. If God had not joined the community of Adam and Eve, they would never have been able to, nor ever have cared to make the paradoxical leap over the gap, indeed abyss, separating two individuals whose personal experiential messages are written in a private code undecipherable by anyone else. Without the covenantal experience of prophetic or prayerful colloquy, again, conversation, Adam absconditus would have persisted in his he role, and Eve abscondita in her she role, unknown to and distant from one another. Only when God emerged from the transcendent darkness of he anonymity into the illumined spaces of community knowability and charged man with an ethical moral mission did Adam absconditus and Eve abscondita, while revealing themselves to God in prayer and his unqualified commitment, also reveal themselves to each other in sympathy and love on the one hand, and in common action on the other. Thus, the final objective of the human quest for redemption was attained. The individual felt relieved from loneliness and isolation, right? And if that is in some sense the ideal of the book, in some way he could have ended it there, if not for the fact that he thought modern society was ruining this from actually happening. But this is what it's supposed to look like, that people can create community in sympathy and love, in solidarity and common action, in working together. And the way that works, and again, there's a causal claim here, so that's enabled by God's revelation. And this too is a claim you find in like other dialogic thinkers and Rosenzweig and Buber. But I think we have to think through, it makes sense in terms of this idea of a person, right? God's revelation for Rav Soloveitchik is the revelation of the reality of things beyond reason, of things beyond instrumental utilitarian calculation and knowledge, right? Once you are open to that, when it comes from God, God sort of appears to the person and insists on that necessity, insists on that reality. When you recognize that within yourself, right? When you feel the experience of, I have these commitments that, I don't know how to explain, that don't add to my life in any measurable fashion, but they are an important part of who I am, then you're open to those in other people, right? And you're at least potentially that you can be open to those in other people. And the question is, can you do that? Can you go from I have these commitments, I have faith, to I'm open to other people's commitments and faith, and from trying to hear that in our shared language? And the issue of shared language is one he raises in the community. The tension between the individual community is just all over all of his writings, particularly in sort of the later period. But this one really tries to hit as many of them as it can. It's a great essay, available online for free on Tradition Online, highly recommended. But here he's going to trace out one distinction or one way that individuality versus sociality affects us. He says that originality and creativity in man are rooted in his loneliness experience, right? In the faith commitments, not in his social awareness. The singleness of man is responsible for his singularity, the latter for his creativity. Social man is superficial, he imitates, he emulates. Lonely man is profound, he creates, he is original. Right? So this dichotomy he wants to raise between the social on the one hand and the individual on the other, and that the social is imitation and emulation. And like I was talking before, language, right? Language fundamentally we get from outside ourselves, and the way we learn to speak is by imitating and emulating other people. If you were just totally innovating your own language, the other person wouldn't be able to understand you. Like, it is not a bug of language that it's repetitive and emulative and imitative. It's a feature. That's how it's supposed to work. Right? We use it to communicate with other people because we all can do that, because we can copy each other. That's what makes communication possible. What the question is then is like, how do you put that together with some sense of originality? How does that work? And we've been examining that throughout in terms of the way you have to sort of express the individual within the social, and those two have to come together in some way. But part of the problem is, what does it mean to be original as opposed to imitative in the halakhic community? Right? If you think about the community as a community whose norms, whose sense of right and wrong is halakha, is these shared norms, what is originality? Right? It's a community that's defined based on questions of right and wrong, in legal terms like illegal and legal, permitted, forbidden, those sorts of things. What does it mean to innovate in that context? And like, broadly speaking, innovation maybe it's a little too narrow, but broadly speaking, to either be extra strict, to have come up with new laws and restrictions, or it means to transgress, right? To have decided you're going to deviate from the community in some way, right? If being a person is about in Living Faith is these faith commitments that deviate from modernity, and the question is there, and here in the community, he's not even talking about modernity versus religious community. He's just talking about individual versus any community. Like, what does it mean to be someone who might deviate within the context of the religious community? And like, how does that work? So with that, we're going to look at this piece from Catharsis. Again, one of my sort of favorite pieces. I will set up already that it talks about tshuva at the end here. And we're going to see that in some ways it's in fully opposite to, and I have to think consciously refuting his discussion of tshuva that we saw from halakhic man we looked at last week. I called it the idea of tshuva as being the programmable self, that you can sort of totally program yourself. This is going to be fully different. But broadly, this is the end of an essay called Catharsis. And catharsis is a fancy word that means something like cleansing, like it comes from the idea that ancient Greeks would go to plays to sort of purge themselves of unhappy emotions. For Rav Soloveitchik, it means to cleanse yourself of arrogance, essentially. He sees arrogance as the fundamental sin of modernity, in line with everyone we talked about so far, technology and utilitarianism and those sorts of things. And the question is, can you see yourself as you really are? And he goes through 4 different areas where it's important to have an experience of cleansing. One is aesthetic, which includes say appetitive, like your desires, your bodily, very bodily desires, and the way halacha pushes back against that. Emotions, and the way halacha can in some ways regulate our emotions. Intellectual world, which is not actually about halacha regulating our intellect, but the ways in which we have to be critical of our intellect, that it's not capable of answering all questions, and also in the moral religious world, right? So this is taken from the end. This whole, these 3 paragraphs or so I have here are taken from the end of the essay, where he talks about the importance of catharsis, of purging our like negative arrogance in the religious realm of our lives. Because a man must be ready to accept defeat, not only in the carnal, aesthetic, emotional, or intellectual world, but also in the moral religious world, in his relationship with God. Man must be capable of recognizing that he is subject, willy-nilly again. He likes this phrase, against his will. The dialectical movement, even in his encounter with God, even when he is certain that God is close to him, and all he has to do is make the final leap into the embrace of his maker. The dialectical movement, meaning the back and forth between 2 poles, even when you feel certain you're close to God, you are still subject to this. There is an unredeemed moral and religious experience, just as an unredeemed body, unredeemed logos, right? The same way he said these all areas could be unredeemed. Here too, there could be unredeemedness in religion. Let us be candid. If one has not redeemed his religious life, he may become insensitive or even destructive. The story of the Crusades, the Inquisition, or other outbursts of religious fanaticism bear out this thesis, right? So the claim is that you have to honestly recognize the nature of real religious life. Otherwise, you become self-righteous, insensitive, and even destructive. And his examples are the Crusades and the Inquisition, other outbursts of religious fanaticism, but they're examples of religious intolerance. We need to define religion in whatever space, whether it's the Holy Land, whether it's Spain, based on our own sense of what religious life is supposed to look like. We can't accept other people doing religion their way in that space, right? That if you are religiously arrogant, you're going to think you understand God perfectly. You understand what other people should be doing in terms of their religious life. You are going to enforce the social over the individual, as it were, in the language we've been talking about so far, right? You're going to take your vision and force it across the space. Catharsis of religious life consists exactly in the awareness of the long interludes during which man finds himself at an infinite distance from God, like recognizing that closeness to, or depth farthest or distance from God in your own sense of it is not something within your control. The periodic states of ecstasy engendered by the feeling of closeness to God alternate with states of black despair, which even the prophet encounters from moments of exile from the presence of the Almighty. Those long periods of black despair, hester panim, traditional language, contain the cathartic element which cleanses and redeems religious life. The breaking of the covenantal tablets is an experience every committed individual must endure. Only after Moshe had lost everything he was questing for did he ascend Har Sinai to receive not only 2 new tablets of stone, but also the radiant countenance and the great mission of transmitting and teaching Torah to the covenantal community. And so after, the golden calf and the destruction of the first 2 tablets, Moshe goes back up to Har Sinai. When he comes down with his face glowing, and he has to wear a mask so Bnei Israel can see him. But when he teaches them, he speaks to them, then he takes the mask off. And because those are 2 new things that were brought in by the tempering of religious sensibilities that comes from recognizing your own limits and recognizing the way you aren't in control of your own religious life, because your own feelings about God, your faith, your commitments go beyond what your own rational and intentional control. And then because that also recognizing the need to make space for others. And again, he is invoking the image of the radiant face of Moshe and the mission of teaching, where it says that Moshe specifically puts on a mask to make space for the Jews who can't stand the glowingness of his face, right? So that sense of limiting yourself to open up to the other people around you and what they need is baked in here. On the long life journey, at one point or another, one must reach the absurd stage at which one finds oneself bankrupt and forlorn. The Bible, with ruthless honesty, recorded such experiences of failure in the lives of our greatest. Man must be cognizant of this tragic fact, which sooner or later he must encounter, if his metaphysical destiny is must be realized, right? So you can't realize your own metaphysical destiny. You can't be your man. So us as a species, we can't become who we're supposed to be if we don't recognize that failure and loss are an important part of what it means to be human. Great is not the man who has never faltered, but the man who tripped, fell, and rose again to greater heights. And here's what I think in some ways is the most important point. Sin is a reality, not just a potential threat. Perfect man has never been created. The man is not conscious of the contradiction inherent in the very core of his personality. He lives in the world of illusion and leads an unredeemed existence. It matters not what we call such a complacent state of mind, self-righteousness, pride, haughtiness, stupidity. It is all a manifestation of a brutish and raw state of mind. Right? It says that if you're so arrogant to think that you will never sin, you just don't understand what it means to be a person. You are haughty and arrogant and self-righteous, right? There's something deeply modern to the sense that you can make yourself, in the sense Rav Soloveitchik likes to talk about modernity as idolizing human being, human potential. There's something very modern in the sense that you can take full charge of your religious life. At this point, the idea of tshuva emerges and conveys to man the message of catharsis. And what does this catharsis express itself, right? What is it going to be if it can't be that tshuva is making yourself who you're supposed to be? It's the aptitude of man, the ability of man to take a critical look at himself and to admit failure, and the courage to confess, to plead guilty, and the readiness to accept defeat, right? And that's what it's been throughout all these different areas. And this is sort of his critical perspective towards modernity, here turned against religious life and religious standards themselves. That what tshuva means here is not to change yourself, it's to recognize the ways in which you can't change yourself, that you will have tendencies towards sin that are just inherent in what it means to be a human being. When I teach this piece, I always mention I have a very distinct memory of, I must have been 19, 20. I was talking with a friend. We were dorm counselors in a gap year yeshiva, and I declared I refuse to believe in the inevitability of sin, that like God would not give us the commandments if we weren't supposed to keep them and weren't capable of keeping them. In fancy philosophical language, ought implies can. If you've been say that someone ought to do something, you mean that you believe they can do it. I just don't think that's true. I think it's a mistaken perception of what it means to be a human being. What it means to be a human being from time immemorial has been that we don't live up to our own best sense of how we think our lives should go. And Rav Soloveitchik is pointing at here in the same way he's pointing at in the discussion of faith as depth commitments that undermine our critical rationality, that even in religious life, there are parts of ourselves that will always undermine who we think we should be, and that should really importantly shape how we shape community, right? Can we create a community that makes space for people who fail to live up to their own standards, which are also the communal standards, right? If we're going to create a community that is a halakhic community where halakha is the standard, what does it mean to accept that people are never going to live up to halakha all the time, right? You won't get all people keeping halakha all the time. And communities have to have red lines. It's the definition of a community. Not having red lines is not something anyone would ever endorse. But how can you decide that there are some lines that deviating them from them sometimes doesn't mean you're outside the community? Like, how does that work? It's not something anyone can ever answer for everyone. It's not a universalizable question. But Rav Soloveitchik is saying here that it has to be asked. You have to have space for that. Otherwise, you're just on a minor scale recommitting the same basic act of the Inquisition and the Crusades. So you're doing that on a smaller level. So I left us 2 minutes. I apologize if there's more questions than that, but I'm very happy to hear everyone's thoughts, questions on this. Lindsay, did that speak at all to your questions you were asking earlier and in the last class as well about how this works for enforcing communal and religious norms and that sort of question?
It definitely does. And I think you really got into this whole idea of making room within a halakhic community for dissent and how there's room for it, but there are still lines. We were kind of getting into this in Rabbi Ozar's class on Monday night as well, which I'm also taking. And it's just sort of fascinating to see where the shifts are and what's allowed and what isn't, but also to maintain the integrity of the community from sort of this greater religious, but also cultural point of view.
Yeah, as I said, not like universally answerable questions, but they're
Yeah.
important ones. Okay, so
I think I just want to learn catharsis more inside before I can like even respond. I'm just like, okay.
yeah, again,
But-
recommended. It's all like community. It's available free online on Tradition's website. Highly recommended.
Okay.
So I guess with that, I'll quickly say we will come back next week to the broader questions of technology and sort of what kind of world we want to make, and looking at Rav Soloveitchik's essay, Confrontation on Interfaith Dialogue. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Drisha. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming and learning. I hope to see you next week. And if you want to learn more with Risha, we have a new class starting next week on Sunday, February 25th at 1 p.m. This is Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Nidarim with Rabbi David Silver. This is a continuation of our ongoing Mishnah in Depth series, currently on Tuesday nights with Rabbi Leah Sarna, following roughly the Mishnah Yomit series. I will post the link for where you can sign up for that in chat. And with that, everyone, take care. All right.